Welcome to episode 14. This is the next to last installment in the series. As you can see, the model is finally finished and installed on its display base. How it gets to this point is still a long way off and there's much to do. So let's get to it. I decided at the beginning of the project to display this model in what's become my traditional and totally artistically licensed way. That is, up on a pair of sawhorses, and the infield or the floor of the case would look like either the main deck of a whaler with its 1 by 12 protective sheathing or a shop floor, viewer's choice. What I'm about to say, I know you've heard me say it before, but when stepping outside the bounds of historical accuracy for the sake of appearance, it bears repeating. This method of display is totally fictitious. It would never happen in a real-life situation. Let's look at why. An empty whaleboat, 28 feet long, weighs about 1,000 pounds. And to that you can add another 1,000 pounds for all the gear. Now you've got a pretty hefty object balancing on two makeshift stands not meant to ever hold even a quarter of that weight. The horses would also need to have some sort of cribbing to hold the boat upright. And because at this point someone could knock the boat entirely off just by bumping into it, there needs to be some means of securing it to the floor or some other stationary object, putting even more downward pressure on the already stressed sawhorses. And as if that weren't enough, working against this style of display, what are you going to do with a 1-ton object in the middle of the main deck of your working vessel? How do you plan on moving it? And yet, here we are. But I justify it by saying, as long as I, and now you know, that this is not historically accurate, and it serves the model, then it's valid. You have to admit, it does show the model to a good advantage. And it also projects a sort of rustic workaday charm and atmosphere, don't you think? Now, the first step in making the display is to make the mounts. In this case, that's the sawhorses. Now, since I've done this quite a lot, I find it's easier to make a jig to standardize the way the horses look. Nothing complicated, just something to hold the parts in their proper spots. Now, I've sized the jig to produce horses that are roughly 3 feet high, 4 feet long, but really the length can be anything that fits the needs of the model. The tops I make anything between 15 and 18 inches wide. I use basswood for this, and in common sizes. 2x4, 2x6, that kind of thing. Remember, this is the 19th century being portrayed here, so dimensional lumber actually was 2 inches by 4 inches, 2 inches by 6 inches. You get the idea. But here you're really free to choose whatever you think looks right for your model. And the legs, as I built them, are cut to the right size and the angle, and in this case that's 67.5 degrees. They get a light sanding with 220 grit paper, and then they go into the jig. A spot of glue, and the 2x4 goes in place, and the assembly is left to dry. Now, I try and be careful with the glue, but I always seem to manage to get some part of the thing stuck to the jig. I try and be very gentle when removing it, because at this stage the structure is really pretty delicate. And I actually find that it's a good practice to trunnel the 2x4s to the legs. If you've never thought about making trunnels, give it a try. With just a little practice, you can become pretty consistent and quick. And as you see, I'm just using plain old toothpicks here. Round toothpicks, I like those better than the square ones. And all you really need to do this is the toothpick and a sanding disc or a emery disc in a Dremel or a flexible shaft. Anything will do, really, as long as you have some control over the speed. Now, I use a fairly low RPM for better control. And a medium grit. We don't want it removing material way too fast. So nothing above a medium grit, really. And again, this is to give greater control over the operation. So just start the sanding disc, and as you apply the toothpick, start rolling it between your fingers. And in less than 5 seconds, you've got a trunnel. Flip the toothpick over, do the other end. And the ones you see me using here are roughly 25 thousandths of an inch in diameter. I cut the tops from a scrap of boxwood that just happened to be the right thickness and the right width. And I used my angle jig to keep things more or less square. There's usually a little bit of tweaking that needs to be done, but having the jig really keeps that to a minimum. Now, I cut some oversized 2x4s, and then they get glued onto the legs along the horse's length to complete the structure. And when it's dry, the excess is cut away, and anything that needs sanding gets it. In keeping with the theme of trying new ways to do things, I've added some cribbing blocks to the tops of the horses to capture the boat. These don't need to conform to the shape of the hull, but the hull should rest on the blocks and the keel should rest on the top of the sawhorse. As I said, these are only meant to capture the keel and hold the boat in an upright attitude. Here it's best to leave some wiggle room to adjust for positioning. So no tight fit here. Adding these blocks really made it very convenient to apply and remove the boat during the positioning process. Later, when all the positions are finalized, I put the stubs of a couple of straight pins in the tops of the horses where the keel goes. A spot of glue on each pin, the boat gets pressed down into place, and that's the mounting complete. A detail I forgot to mention before beginning the display is the painter. This is a detail that's best done before the model is permanently attached to the sawhorses. Painters on whaleboats were roughly 30 feet long, and they're easy enough to make. It's simply a length of line 5/8 of an inch in diameter or 3/4 of an inch in diameter that's secured to the stem with an eye splice. It runs through a hole right for that purpose. The bitter end can be left plain or finished with a knot of some kind, and I tend to coil my painters around a paintbrush handle of an appropriate size to give me nice size coils, and I keep those coils in place with 1 or 2 clove hitches. And when it's time to stow it, I put it up near the hatchet and the head sheets, up near the thigh board. So now that the model is securely mounted with the painter installed, the next thing we need to consider is the display base. I'll be using the terms infield and display base interchangeably here. Same thing, different words. Off camera, I temporarily installed the rig and the steering oar to get the overall dimensions of the model. Now, when deciding on the size for a case, I like to leave 2 inches in all directions for larger models, and for projects this size, I cut that back a bit. Anything from 1 inch to 1.5 inches in all directions will do nicely. So that would give us an infield roughly 3 inches longer and wider than the model is overall, and 1.5 inches taller. This is strictly an aesthetic call on my part. Whatever looks right for you may be totally different. Now, once I've got all the sizes, I cut a piece of 1/2 inch MDF for the infield, and I make this about 1/2 inch oversized in all directions. You'll see the need for that in a couple of minutes. I used my usual planking pattern of planks from 5 to 20 feet, with the butt joints repeating every 4th course. Since this planking is meant to represent the sheathing applied to the main deck of a whaling ship or the floor of a boat shop, there's no need to show caulking lines or trunnels. Even without the sheathing, a whale ship's deck would not be trunneled. In the past, I've trunneled my displays before I saw the light. Older and wiser. With the pattern laid out, I can prep the stock for the planking. And the planks are 1 scale foot wide, 3/8 of an inch, and I've left them a little on the thick side, roughly a shy 1/16. And after they're installed, they will get a sanding to eliminate any unevenness between adjoining planks, so that over-thick dimension will shrink a bit. And I use poplar for this, and I try and stick to using the heartwood. But a bit of sapwood is fine and could actually even add a bit of visual interest. I tend to prepare quite a bit more than I think I will actually use, because running short and having to replicate the machine setups to finish the job never really gives a good result, and it eats up a lot of time. Now, the decking will not be mechanically fastened, just glue, and I'm applying tight bond wood glue with a foam roller. I make sure all the edges have a nice even coat. This is a very thin layer of glue, and it has a tendency to dry quickly, so it's important to refresh the glue from time to time. And it's important to do it before the first layer dries completely. Remember, with the exception of contact cement and maybe epoxy, glue does not stick to glue. So, if you let it dry out, you've effectively created a barrier coat between the plank and the substrate. Now, if you're concerned about the glue layers building up and creating an uneven planking surface, don't bother. Some of that first coat will be absorbed by the MDF. That, coupled with the fact that the glue is applied in layers too thin to measure, makes this a non-issue. And even if one does get a little heavy-handed with the glue, the display is going to be sanded down when it's dry. So, more glue and more planks till I'm done. Once they are all in place, I cover the planks with a board and I put a couple of cinder blocks on top of it till it's dry. Now, this particular base didn't need much of a sanding. Off camera, I trimmed off the excess to the finished dimensions I wanted for my base, eased the edges, gave it a light coat of amber shellac, both to seal it and to give it a warmer hue. A quick scuffing with some 4/0 steel wool, and it's time to locate the model. And a piece of masking tape down the middle allows for all the registration marks. Positioning the model on the infield is no great trick. It's mostly done by eye and how you want things to look based on the sizes you've decided to make your case. The only important thing is to make sure that the model's center line is parallel to either the center line of the infield or parallel to one of the long edges. In the lower right, you can see the masking tape with my center line marked out. And at the upper part of the frame, you'll notice the other piece of tape with the location for the bow. Now, once everything is where I want it, I discreetly mark the positions on the sawhorses on their legs. I apply a bit of glue to all 8 legs and then put them in place and let it dry completely before I do anything else. And after it has dried, I drill holes in the horse's legs and I pin them with some 14 thousandths steel wire. Music wire is great for this. The wire gets glued in place too. And at this point, the assembly is a bit fragile, and it will remain that way until I complete the steps you see me carrying out here. Now, I made a few eye bolts and jump rings, and these will be assembled and used to secure some lashings around the oarlocks down to the rings and then fixed with a couple of half hitches. And this will add the needed stability that the display requires. I brush them with some very thinned out white glue, and I hit them with a blow dryer, and when the glue is dry, everything is actually quite secure. Stowing all the gear in the boat isn't all that hard, but to avoid frustration, it should be done in a certain way. Items that have to go in specific spots, like the line tubs, the hatchet, the knives, they should go in first. The sailing rig should also go in about now. This way, it can be secured with its lanyard and the excess trimmed away without much else being around it to hinder you. Now, logically, things that go in the bottom of the boat, and long things like the wave poles, the boat hook, the cutting spade, the paddles, that kind of stuff, should all be installed at this early stage. A quick word about the paddles here. Now, the paddles in a whaleboat were usually not left loose. They were lashed to the riser under each thwart. In the past, I've taken the time to secure the paddles this way, but early on, I realized it made absolutely no visual difference in the finished model. One would have to know to look for this feature, and then, because all the gear would be in the way on top of them, still not be able to see it. Moving on, the grapnel might go in up forward in the head sheets. The freshwater cask, the towing toggle, they might go towards the stern, in the stern sheets. The bailing piggin, the nippers, the line bucket, all go towards aft end, and the drugs might easily go under the midship oar. If the boat is to be shown with the whale line rigged, it should be done before the oars and the spare irons and the lances and all the other stuff that's going to go on top of the thwarts. It should be done before those pieces go in. Otherwise, you'll work so hard to get that whale line looking just right, and you'll upset it with the peripheral work. And this would actually be a good time to take care of that whale line. And rigging the whale line eats up quite a bit of rope, so be sure to leave yourself a good 100 scale feet. I know it seems excessive, but better to have too much than too little. In this scale, that's 37.5 inches. And remember, it has to go from the large line tub, travel aft to the loggerhead, take 1 or 2 turns around there, and then it travels forward all the way up to the thigh board, and it goes underneath the kicking strap on the thigh board. From there, it goes to the bow, through the bow chocks, under the pin there, and then it's going to come back towards the warp box. And about 50 or 60 feet gets coiled up in the warp box. Now this 50, 60 foot length of line is the piece that's actually called the warp. I don't know why it's called the warp. I never did learn that. Maybe somebody out there knows why, and you can leave it in the comments below. Anyway, from there it gets attached to the first iron with a double becket hitch, and you'll see me doing that in a little bit. There's a second length of line called, oddly enough, the short warp, and that's about 24 feet. At one end, it's attached to the warp by means of a loosely tied bowline. and the other end is attached to the second iron with that same double becket hitch as the first. Now, this is a lot of line going into a very small space, so a couple of things have to be considered here. You need to be very careful with how you stow the main warp in the box. Take your time with this. If you rush it, it will show. And actually, you can avoid a lot of frustration by simply cutting back on the length of your warp. As long as you leave enough to give the impression that there's a lot of rope up there, that should be sufficient to convey the point. Nobody is going to unravel the warp on your model to see if you really have 50 or 60 scale feet of line in there. This is an instance where fidelity to scale appearance is more important than being 100% historically accurate. The second thing to consider is the short warp. Here too, the approach has to do with preserving the scale appearance of the model rather than being 100% faithful to actual practice. In actual practice, the second warp does not sit on top of the first. That would cause the lines to tangle as they paid out. It was attached far enough down the first warp to allow the harpooner time to dart the second iron if there was a chance, or give him enough time to throw it overboard if there wasn't. Instead of actually attaching the short warp to the first, you can just slide the bitter end between a couple of flakes of the main warp, and you can do that later. This avoids the issue of having to deal with a very bulky knot ruining the appearance of your carefully stowed whale line, and the additional 24 scale feet of line you now have to cram into an already overcrowded warp box. So feel free to take the same approach here as with the main warp. Leave just enough to give the appearance of an undetermined length of line. Not having to deal with trying to stow 48 inches of line into a triangular box less than 3/8 wide and 3/8 of an inch deep will pay large dividends to your tranquility. Ask me how I know. And at the end of the day, only the most rabid of whaling history nerds would even be able to tell that such a detail might be missing. Another instance where pragmatism wins out over academia. Just saying. Now, there may be some of you out there who will take exception to the remarks I just made about scale appearance versus historical accuracy. But before you reach for your keyboards, let me try and put a little personal perspective on this. The amount of actual practice that can be portrayed effectively in a model is directly related to two factors. One is the skill level of the builder, and the other is the scale at which the subject is being rendered. If I were building this model at 1:12 or 1:8, most of the methods and many of the materials that you've seen here would be very, very different. The hull would not have been carved from a piece of wood. It would have been planked over a form and then framed. And those frames would not simply be glued in place. They would have to be mechanically fastened, possibly even clench-nailed, if I were that clever. There would be no silk span sail. It would have a woven fabric sail that's really stitched together, real woven eye splices, not marlin splices, and the list goes on. But the point is this. As the working scale gets smaller, the amount of actual practice that can be effectively shown diminishes. And finding a way to make all those concessions to scale limitations has been at the core of my model building life. How does one make a windlass that in real life would be 10 feet long, way over a ton? And how do you make that look convincing at 3.5 inches long? How do you convey the features or the textures of the surfaces? how do you convey that sense of mass that such an item would have? And speaking strictly for myself, it isn't by following real practices. I do it by finding materials that come close to the actual thing and then developing methods to effectively convey the essence of that piece. Now, beyond materials and technique is the model's ability to evoke curiosity. It should make me, or it should make anyone who sees it, want to learn more. Learn something I didn't know before I looked at it. Put another way, if a person looks at a model and after a few seconds moves on, that model really hasn't done much for the viewer. A couple of bites of eye candy and it's on to the next thing. But if they start to wonder what it would be like to be on that vessel, or to work that windlass, to live a life so foreign to us here in the 21st century, then I would call that a very effective model, regardless of the manner in which it was built. Oh, my, look at the time. The soapbox hour is nearly over. We better get back to the model. So if you're still standing after dealing with the warps and that sidebar, it's time to give our whaleboat some teeth. As I mentioned before, these boats carried 2 live irons bent to the warps and mounted in a crotch. The more inboard iron was attached to the long warp and the outer to the short warp. The crotch simply gets slipped into the 2 brackets on the gunnel and the riser. No need for glue here. It's not going anywhere. As far as bending lines onto the iron, the best way to do it would be with the harpoon fixed in something like X-Acto extra hands or that kind of thing. It has a big advantage of allowing you to tie a pretty bulky knot on an item that is held securely in place. But for me, it has one drawback I haven't yet overcome. That is, having to leave more warp out of the box so I can tie the hitch. I've found I'm just not graceful enough to do this without inadvertently pulling more line out of the box. So for me, for the first iron, it's easier to work close to the warp box and close to the crotch while doing this. Well, close to the crotch, that really didn't sound right. For me, it's a lot easier to work close in on this. It allows me to keep an eye on the entire area of concern, and if I see I'm getting a bit heavy-handed with the line, I will see it right away and stop myself from causing any damage. So here I do have an iron held in a clamp, but this is the second iron with the short warp being installed. And even though it's out of focus in the background, you can just make out the first iron is attached to the whale line, the long warp. That was done as I just described. But for this second iron, I can be a bit more cavalier. And after everything is dry, I can cut off the extra warp and tuck that under the first warp back in the box and adjust the lay of the lines to look more natural. Well, at this point, the model is almost finished. The extra harpoons, the lances, the oars can be installed along with any remaining cooperage. And for any of those other parts that are still on your workbench that are not supposed to go in a specific location, feel free to indulge yourself, within reason. You'll notice in the rolling footage, on the starboard side of the boat, where the extra irons are, there is what looks like a flap of canvas. At least that's what I hope it looks like to you. This is a rather ineffective, in my humble opinion, means of protecting the harpoon heads from damage and salty spray. And I guess to protect the crew from them as well. There's one on the port side for the lances, too. There are just two major details left, stowing the rudder and the steering oar. I'll go over the rudder first. The rudder has two lines to secure it to the boat when it's not being used. It doesn't make any difference which one you belay first. One is the trip line. This is a piece of small diameter line that runs through the top end of the rudder, above the mortise for the tiller. It runs through a hole drilled through the top of the stern post, and it belays to a small cleat fixed on the lion's tongue. And the other line is the line that holds the rudder tight to the outside of the boat. Now that line is rove through a hole, roughly in the center of the rudder's blade, and it has some kind of a stopper knot. You can tie any kind of knot that looks right to you. There are a few variations on leading and belaying this line, but on this model, I've opted to drill a steeply diagonal hole through the shear strake just under the main rail, and the line runs through this hole to the boat's interior and is belayed to the sheet cleat. And that's the rudder properly installed. And the last big item is the steering oar. Now, in the past, I've never had a specific point in the process to install this, but with this model, for some reason, I've put it off almost till the end. And actually, I'm kind of glad I did. With this part being almost as long as the boat itself, and pretty spindly, it's prone to being damaged during the assembly process. So I think it wound up being better that I left this till the end. Now, ordinarily, this task would take probably under a minute. But because I took a step out of sequence in episode 13, I have to fall back to plan B. In that episode, I made and installed the steering oar stirrup. I also belayed the lanyard that holds that stirrup tight. I shouldn't have done that then. The dimensions of the oar, the steering oar, prevented me from just being able to slide it through the stirrup. Fortunately, the end of the stirrup is only glued into the hole on the outrigger. So it was a fairly easy thing to just dislodge that end, put the oar in its position, and then glue the end of the stirrup back in place. With that small hiccup out of the way, the model is now finished. A very long project is about to come to an end. The boat is complete, no more parts to make or install, and it's mounted on the display base. At this point, it's a good idea to spend more than a little time examining the model. With so many details, it's easy for small items to get overlooked. I did this, and I found three things that really, quite frankly, surprised me. The most egregious of the three was the aft lifting eye. I never made it or installed it. You'll see that. I also avoided making the drugs. And something I did make, but fell out at some point, was the harpooner's oarlock. Now, lucky for me, these were all easy fixes. Even after having built 56 of these things, I still find it absolutely necessary to carefully go over the whole thing until I'm sure everything looks the way it should. Coming up in the series conclusion, I take you through the process of making a glass and brass case. Now, warning, this is not for the faint of heart, and you may really never want to do it and have somebody else do this for you, but you'll see the process anyhow, and you can decide for yourself. And there'll be a couple of small announcements, too. And that episode will be out very soon. So, until next time, thanks, always, for sticking with this project. Don't forget to share it with anybody that you think might benefit from it. And remember to treat each other nicely. Now, break's over. Get back in the shop.